Okay, let's start off then with a tip that I have ignored in the past, and each time it has cost me dearly. Hello guys, and welcome back to the VolksWizard channel. Now, the Corrado VR6 is one of my favourite Volkswagens of all time. In fact, it's the car that inspired me to start VolksWizard. Today, 27 years after production ceased, I'd say it's one of the best modern classic cars you can buy. That's because it doesn't drive like a classic car. It's still fast, it sounds amazing, it's still a cool car, everybody loves them, and they are by and large pretty reliable, but they're still an old car and there's quite a lot to look out for if you're looking to buy one. So today's video, I'm going to share with you 20 years experience of buying and selling these cars with 10 top tips to help you buy yourself a good one. But before we get started, I'd like to say a big thanks to everybody who has subscribed to the channel. It does mean an awful lot. If you haven't yet though, please do so. There's an icon on the bottom right of your screen, or there's a link in the description of the video below, or just look for that famous red button and click that. Right, let's get started then with tip number 10. Okay, let's start off then with a tip that I have ignored in the past, and each time it has cost me dearly. Now, about 10 years ago, Corrado VR6s were not worth an awful lot. You could buy them from £1,000 up to about £6,000 for the very best, and that meant that when long-term owners came to sell, they weren't really being offered an awful lot in part exchange, and they could often afford to keep the Corrado and buy the new car. But they tended to drive the new car. The Corrado got neglected, it ran out of MOT, it ran out of tax, and it just stood on the driveway. Now, the problem with that is that cars do not like being left standing still. Things like wheel bearings, brake pipes, brake discs, brake calipers, pretty much any mechanical part will just seize up or corrode, and any corrosion that's already there, because bearing in mind they could have been like 10 to 15 years old at that point. Anyway, any corrosion, like an open wound, will just get worse when the car's been stood. So my top tip is to be very wary of cars that have got a big gap in their MOT history where they've been stood still. They might have attractively low mileages because they haven't been used, but quite often they need a lot of recommissioning work, and that may not have been done just to get it through the MOT. So you might find corrosion that's not mentioned on the MOT is probably in a worse state than cars that have been used. This Corrado VR6 has done 148,000 miles, which is quite a lot, but because it's constantly been used, it's actually caused me much less mechanical grief than lower mileage cars that have been stood. So yeah, buy one that's been regularly used, and that should be a good start. Corrado parts have always been either expensive or hard to find. Well, nowadays they're expensive and hard to find. Volkswagen Classic in Germany are doing a great job reproducing a lot of parts, but by no means everything. And for my own car, I've had to go second-hand for nearly everything, and I've been amazed how much used parts actually cost. So tip number 9 is that if you're looking at buying a Corrado that needs parts, make sure you know how much they cost before you commit to buying the car, because you'll be very, very surprised how expensive even used parts can be. The reason used parts are so expensive is that fewer Corrados are being broken because they're actually worth enough to restore nowadays, and that means when a breaker has got a good part that you can't buy new, he can charge pretty much what he wants for it. For example, doors are actually relatively inexpensive. You could buy a good door for about £60. But if you want the rubber seal that sits on top of that door, guess how much that is? If a breaker had a good one that wasn't buckled, because when you repaint the car you have to take them off, they always sort of turn into a banana, he can charge over £100. I'd pay £100 for a perfect one right now. So yeah, just be careful before you commit, know exactly what things are going to cost, and make sure you allow for it. When the Corrado came out in 1988, the active rear spoiler was a really big deal. Not many cars had stuff like this back then. It was fitted to every single Corrado, regardless of engine. In Germany, it was programmed to come up at 75 miles an hour. Because that was in excess of the UK's highest speed limit, UK cars were programmed for it to come up at 45. And that means UK cars get a lot more use of their rear spoiler, but actually they seem to be proving quite reliable. However, the cars are over 30 years old now. There have been reports of these active spoilers not working, and they can be quite expensive to fix. So tip number 8 is to make sure you check that it works. Now, you can either go for a test drive and just make sure you can see it in the rear view mirrors, which you should be able to do, or maybe someone in the back can check, or you can check when the car's stationary using a switch on the dashboard. So just here under the headlight switch is another little switch. Press it down to go down and up to go up. I'm pretty sure it was there to do a job. These cars can do over 140 miles an hour, and it gives the car a bit less lift at the back at those kinds of speeds. Bearing in mind this came out, I think, 8 years before the Mark 1 TT. It's bizarre that Audi didn't fit this to the TT originally. But yeah, make sure it works because it does actually do a job. Now, the Volkswagen Corrado was one of the first UK supplied Volkswagens to get ABS, anti-lock braking, as standard, but unfortunately it hasn't proven completely reliable. Quite early on there were faults with the pump, and that would cause the ABS light to stay on permanently. What it should do is when you turn the ignition on, it performs a self-check, it puts the light on to show that it works, and then it switches off to say that the system is working correctly. If you see the ABS light on all the time, or if you don't see it come on when you turn the ignition on, then that means there is a problem. Quite often owners would disconnect the ABS light. It's very, very easy to do that, and they do that because A, they didn't think they really needed ABS because most cars didn't have it at the time, so they weren't going to bother to fix it, and B, Volkswagen wanted probably, I think, close to £1,000 for a brand new pump. The good news is that specialists today like Stealth Racing can recondition your ABS pump and make it better and more reliable than new for much less than that. I think probably under £500. So yeah, tip 7 is to check that ABS light very, very carefully. When it comes to buying property, they say location, location, location is key. Well, for me, when it comes to buying cars, it's all about the history. So tip number 6 is to make sure any Corrado VR6 that you're buying has got a comprehensive service history. And that's primarily because without it, you will be unable to verify the mileage, and bearing in mind how much of an impact mileage has on the value of the car. If you can't verify the mileage, how are you going to know what it's worth? I wouldn't really take any notice of what it says on the odometer if you haven't got the paperwork to back it up. These cars are 30 years old now. Many will have done 100,000 miles plus in the first few years, and I'm pretty sure quite a lot of those will have been clocked, and they do wear the mileage pretty well. So buy without a full history at your peril. So what you really want is a original service book. Make sure it matches the car, check the chassis number matches the data sticker in the book, and then at least you know you've got the right book. And then just have a good look. You'll see these genuine stamps. It's not impossible to forge them, so really you could do with having the paperwork as well, and just look for really no more than 10,000 miles between oil changes. It doesn't really matter if there's been a lot of time between them. It's just important to make sure that it's had regular oil changes, particularly because there's a timing chain which is bathed in oil. As well as having a service book, there should be some receipts to back it all up. I know GDPR means that a lot of dealers are shredding these, but they tend to get passed on from owner to owner with cars like this. So you want to be able to verify that at least a large majority of the stamps in here are genuine. Also, we've got MOT history on a computerized database from 2006. So that will cover not all the mileage of these cars. So it's nice to have old MOTs as well. And then you can be pretty confident the car you're buying is a genuine one and one worth spending money on. Now, as I said earlier, the Corrado VR6 is actually a relatively reliable car, but for tips numbers 5 and 4, we're going to have a look under the bonnet because it does have a couple of Achilles heels. The first one is the ignition system. The design of the narrow angle engine means that the spark plugs are very deeply set into the cylinder head, and it can be very, very difficult to remove them. The good news is that each car should come with a plastic spark plug lead removal tool, which does make the process a lot easier, but quite often that's missing, and garages might do things that damage the leads trying to get them off to replace the plugs. That can lead to misfires. So if your car is misfiring, then you need to reckon for about £100 to £200. It could be the leads, or it could be the coil pack that's bolted to the side of the engine here, but more often than not it's the leads, and there are lots of cheap sets available that don't last very long. So that's why you need to allow a good amount of money to get a proper set. The way to test it is to use low revs and a high gear, because that's when you're more likely to feel a misfire when you're putting that much load on the engine at quite low revs. So say about 1500 RPM in 5th gear, and that should be a good test. If it pulls straight through without a misfire, then your ignition system is in great shape. Tip number 4 could prove a little more expensive. The VR6 engine is actually relatively simple. We don't have turbochargers or superchargers. Probably the most complicated part of it is the cooling system. So tip number 4 is to make sure you check it out very, very carefully. Before you go for a test drive, when the engine is stone cold, take the lid off the header tank. It can be quite stiff, and have a good look in there. Make sure the coolant is nice and clean, it's not oily, not got sediment in it. Have a good look at the level before you go for a test drive, and make sure it's above the minimum mark, which is marked on the side there. And then when you come back from a test drive, make sure it hasn't dropped below that. It should get a bit higher during a test drive as the car warms up. Look for leaks as well. A common area is the thermostat housing, which is just underneath the coil pack here. That can leak coolant onto the gearbox, which can be quite visible. Also on the test drive, make sure it warms up quickly and make sure that it doesn't overheat. The only time I've ever seen a VW thermostat fail and cause the car to overheat was actually on a VR6. The car's got a history of overheating. It may have damaged the head gasket, and that can be quite hard for you to work out when you're looking at the car on somebody's driveway. So if you're really concerned about the risk of that, then make sure you get the car checked out by a specialist like Stealth Racing. There's no real point in looking under the oil filler cap for emulsification, because that happens quite a lot on these cars in cold weather when they don't do long journeys. Somebody told me once that the dipstick is much more representative of problems with the head gasket, so it's worth just looking there, making sure the oil is nice and clean. It's also very important to check that the heater works correctly, because if you've got a failed head gasket, you might find that the hot air comes and goes as you're driving. If you've got a blocked heater matrix, you might find that you've got no hot air at all. Also, make sure that the controls work properly, that when you're asking for air to your face, you get it, and also that the temperature of the air varies as you adjust it, because the cables that these controls attach to can sometimes fail, or the flaps can fail as well. And also make sure that the blower motor works on all 4 of its speeds. In the 30 years or so I've been tinkering with Volkswagens, there's one thing in particular I've grown to hate, and that is rust. Volkswagens are generally pretty resilient to it, but you'd be amazed how different 2 cars that left the factory on the same day can be when they get to 30 years old. So tip number 3 is that if you're thinking about buying a Corrado VR6, make sure you inspect it carefully for rust. I wouldn't worry too much about the bolt-on panels like wings, doors, bonnet, tailgate. It's the structure that matters, so have a good look as best as you can if you can't lift the car up. But ideally you need to lift it up and have a good look at the sills, the chassis legs, the rear panel, the A-pillars, just to make sure it's solid. And then if it is, at least you know that if you're going to spend money on paintwork and mechanicals, the actual core part of the car is in good order. Now the good thing about the VR6 engine is that it doesn't have a timing belt. Instead, it has a timing chain. Whilst these are a lot more durable, they don't last forever, though generally it's accepted that about 100,000 miles is the maximum for the timing chain on the VR6 engine. So tip number 2 is that if you're looking at buying a high mileage Corrado VR6, to ask the seller if it's had its timing chain replaced, and if not, to allow about £1,000 for the work. It does get a little bit more complicated though, because if you go to a specialist like Stealth Racing, they will say, well, if we're doing that, we might do the head gasket as well. Or if it's using oil, then you might need to do some work on the bottom end as well, and the bills can spiral upwards. But the important thing to remember, it's the timing chain failure that can scrap the engine. Everything else is a little bit of an inconvenience. So don't put it off too long, but it might be best to get it combined with other work so you've got your Corrado VR6 in the best health possible. And at number 1, we have the Volkswagen Corrado's pretty useless sunroof mechanism. These were going wrong when the cars were just a few years old. I repaired my first one back in 2000, and that wasn't a nice job. You have to take the headliner out. I've also repaired this one, which was a lot easier, But the problem nowadays is that you can't actually get the parts very easily. As far as I know, if anyone knows otherwise, let me know. You can only get the parts second-hand. If you fit second-hand Corrado parts, well, they're just going to break again because they're just not very good. Luckily, parts from the Mark III Golf sunroof mechanism are compatible. I was lucky that on this sunroof, the bit that was broken was identical. So I bought a Mark III sunroof and just took the bit out. People have fitted Mark III sunroofs and Passat sunroofs with a glass panel into Corrados in the past, but the shape of the roof isn't correct for a Corrado, so it's not something you want to do if you want to keep your car original. So if you find a really nice Corrado with a sunroof problem, then don't let it put you off. It is fixable, but it's not going to be particularly easy, and even if you do it yourself, you're going to have to like rummage around for the parts. If you can find a garage to do it, I think they're going to charge you quite a bit of money, but don't let it put you off an otherwise good Corrado. Well guys, I hope those 10 top tips will empower you to buy yourself a very good Corrado VR6. Now they are very old cars now, so if you're not completely confident about spending sort of over £10,000 for a 30-year-old car, then I'd highly recommend you call upon the services of a Volkswagen specialist to give any prospective purchases a good look over. They might charge a couple of £100 for the most thorough of inspections, but that will be money well spent, because I'm pretty sure nearly everyone that's for sale will have at least £200 worth of work needed to make them tip top. But if you do find a good one, you'll have one of the best modern classics you can buy. As ever guys, thanks for watching this VolksWizard video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, keep subscribing, keep commenting, and I'll see you for the next one very soon.